Hello and welcome to the GoodPractice Podcast, a weekly show about work, performance and learning. I'm Ross Garner, and this week we're talking L&D evaluation. How do you know that something you have done has worked? And perhaps provocatively, do you care? Our special guest this week is a real treat, someone we wanted to have on the show for a long time. It's Dr. Will Thalheimer. How are you, Will?
I am doing very well. Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. Do people call you Will? I've only ever heard you referred to as Will Thalheimer.
Well, my mom calls me William.
Okay.
But the rest of the world calls me Will.
Okay, great.
Actually, a lot of people, refuse to call me Will. They want to call me Doctor, Dr. Thalheimer. It's kind of, I feel...
Are you subtly asking me to call you that?
No. I don't want to be called that. Don't call me that.
So, Dr. Will, could you kick us off?
Let's keep this personal.
What is the state of L&D evaluation 2019? I mean, my sense is that it doesn't happen all that often.
Well, that's a big answer. I actually did some research last year with the e-learning guild, and we asked people, what are you actually doing in your measurement? And the two things that we are doing the most are measuring completion and attendance. That's one. That's the big one. We do that more than anything else. And the other thing is using happy sheets or smile sheets. And everything else is very much down the list. Those are the two things we do most. So that's not very good. I compiled last year I started to compile a list of the common mistakes we make in learning evaluation. And I thought maybe I'd come up with 10 or 15, but I ended up with 54. So there's a lot of things that we're not very happy at doing. And, we don't like what we're doing either. When we ask people in this research for the e-learning guild, it was survey research. We asked practitioners in the field. 52% of them said they wish they could substantially change what they're doing. 63% want more rigorous methods. 76% want to measure more of their learning intervention. So I think there's a lot of disappointment, frustration, and sort of a lackadaisicalness about it all.
Well, let's assume that a lot of people listening to this are the people using completion and attendance and happy sheets. I think that's a safe assumption. You imply that this is not a good approach. What's the reason for that?
Well, we're professionals. We should put out a product and we should find out how we're doing and make it better if we're not doing it well. So we're sort of in a black box. We are collecting metrics that are not really related to what the outcomes that we're aiming to get. I mean, there's actually research on the happy sheets or smile sheets that show that they're correlated with learning results at 0.09. Two meta-analyses found the same thing. And so that's virtually no correlation at all. So you get high marks in your smile sheets, you could have a good course, you get almost equally likely you could have a poor course. If you get low marks, you could have a poorly designed course, almost equally likely a well-designed course. So with traditional happy sheets, smile sheets, we really can't tell. So we're in the dark, and it's kind of crazy. Wouldn't we want to create sort of cycles of continuous improvement? And we're clearly not able to do that.
To what extent is that being driven by the fact that we're not being precise in how we define what we're talking about when we use the word evaluation? It's been banged around for years and years and years. But sometimes it seems to me that we're looking for something that doesn't exist, right? I think people are looking for a cookie cutter approach that can help us determine whether we're doing a good job or not for a whole range of different kinds of interventions. And there's, I think of it, there's two components to a lot of what we do in L&D, right? There's the ultimate change that we're looking to impact, and then there's the intervention that we're using in order to change performance to result in that ultimate impact. And so you can quite easily have a really successful intervention that changes behavior in some way, shape, or form that doesn't result in the ultimate impact that you're looking to have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's complicated. I mean, let's be real, right? Learning is a really amazingly complex phenomenon. And then if we add measurement on top of that, and then we think about measuring at these different levels or different perspectives, it's even more complicated. So yeah, absolutely. In some sense, there's a chain. These things affect each other, right? So if I create some learning intervention and people don't pay attention to it or don't use it, then they're not going to get any outcomes. They're not going to comprehend. If they do comprehend, they may forget it later. If they do remember it later, they may not apply it later. They may fail in applying it. If they apply it successfully, they may not get the results that we intended or that we hoped for. So all along that spectrum, there's a lot of things we might measure. What I like to argue is that we should try to figure out, we should sort of step back and ask, why do we evaluate in the first place? And my answer to that question is to help us make our most important decisions, right? The decisions that we have to make as learning professionals so that we can get better at what we're doing, so we can stop doing bad things, we can continue doing good things. If we're not doing that, then we're not really doing what we should be doing.
But I think there are some other possible outcomes as well, I think, though, which is that it came up a bit on our live show in London that we did a few weeks ago. We were talking about whether there were benefits to classroom training. Often the answer was that no, the kind of learning materials aren't that useful, but there is a benefit to getting people from diverse parts of the business into a room and they get to know one another and they have these conversations. So it's not that we're going to evaluate and find out if something worked or not. It's things might be working in all sorts of different unintended ways. And one of the things that you might be measuring is whether what you intended to happen actually happened. But then if it didn't happen, there might be all sorts of other things that happened that aren't being measured either. Is that fair to say?
That's very fair to say. So you're talking about sort of the social benefits, the networking, but that sort of gets, you can see how this ripples out, right?
It's a cop-out answer, maybe. Is that, even as you repeat that back to me, it's like a cop-out answer. Well, what I did didn't work, but it already had these so many other benefits that were useful. You should definitely give me more money.
So yeah, one of the things that goes on that actually kind of irritates me is a trainer will get up there and say, if I just influence one person, then I've made the difference. But if there were 30 people in the room and you only influenced one, if you're going to evaluate yourself, that's not so great. The other thing you mentioned was sort of the side benefits, right? Things we don't think about, like networking, getting people together to network. That could enable them to learn more in the future as they, connect with each other. So there are a lot of these side benefits. We can aim to create those things. We can just sort of see them as things that may happen. Now, I think we have to decide what we care about, right? Let's start out there. In fact, I think that's what we design learning in the beginning. We should, instead of first creating a set of learning objectives, we should create a set of evaluation objectives. What are the things that we think we ought to be measuring? And let's get our stakeholders involved in that, our business stakeholders, our team, et cetera. What do we want to measure? And then let's start from that. And some things we're going to decide it's worth measuring. Some things we're going to decide it's not worth measuring. It's too costly, it's too time consuming, the metrics aren't there, et cetera.
Yeah, although a part of me thinks if that's the case, why are you bothering to make the change in the first place? Because for any intervention, you've basically got three possible outcomes that you have. Depending on how much research is backing up what you're putting in place, you have different degrees of confidence around. But it could have a positive outcome on sort of ultimate performance. It could have no impact whatsoever, or it could have a negative consequence. And it feels to me like we never talk about the third thing. Let's assume that's not the case. But unless you're measuring it, you don't know whether you're actually having a detrimental impact. If you are, you want to stop that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I see that as well. I do think we completely miss talking about what we might be doing that can harm people.
Oh, there's an example in, I think it's in Nudge by Thaler and Sunstein. They talk about the approaches that different medical specialists take. So when they're faced with someone, the surgeon always wants to operate, and the doctor always wants to administer a drug. But there is no one there representing the let's do nothing part of that equation. And so the surgeon is measured on the number of successful operations that they have, and the doctor is evaluated on how well the drugs have worked. But they're, by picking the thing that they're going to be measured against, they almost kind of skew it towards their own version of success. It's not based on the patient outcome as a whole with all these three options in mind.
Yeah, I'm going to recommend a book to your listeners, Jerry Muller's Tyranny of Metrics. And he goes through example after example after example of how sometimes when we aim to measure, it actually creates some bad effects. And one of the examples is from medicine, right? We know that if we do some diagnostics, that people will, there's false positives and people will get operated on when they don't need those operations. He talks about the policing situation where police will, they have some goals in their precinct, right? And what happens is they start manipulating the data, and they do this sort of almost unconsciously to make it look like good results, and it actually creates a backfire effect. So, there's a lot of that.
That's like the is it psychological studies? Oh, and you've talked about this a few times. A surprising number that are just significant.
Oh yeah,
and it's a far higher number or just meet that threshold than you would expect. Well, I am curious because you said there were 54 things, I think, that people were doing wrong as far as evaluation goes. If you could maybe pick like the top ones.
The top ones. Well, I can tell you some of the categories. When we measure learner perceptions, right? We use Likert-like scales, and those create fuzzy data, numerical scales. I already talked about those two meta-analyses. There's a lot of biases when we measure learning. We fail to measure learning factors. We put learning in one bucket, right? So we measure learning. Well, what is that? It could be regurgitating meaningless information. It could be, being able to make real important decisions. It could be actually able to carry out complex tasks. This is all learning. We can measure learning that way, but we put it into one bucket. We fail to really measure on-the-job learning, or even to look at that. One of the biggest mistakes we make is we tend to measure what's easy to measure. We already talked about this, right? Completions, attendance, happy sheet data, but not what's important to measure. Whether people can actually do realistic tasks, whether they're actually using it in their job, whether they're sharing it with others, whether it's having a good effect or a bad effect. There's things like failing to consider the importance of remembering. So oftentimes we think that if we measure people during the training, that's enough, but we know from the research on learning that people can forget, and that there's some things we need to do in our learning designs to support people in remembering. But if we only measure them during the session or right after it, then we haven't given them time to slip down the forgetting curve. Pre-tests can create, if we give people a pre-test and then a post-test, well, the pre-test is actually acting as part of the learning event. And if we don't consider that, we create biased results. So there's a big long list. If anybody searches for 54 common mistakes, they'll probably come up with my blog post. And there's other things, and I'd actually like people to add to that if they find other things.
We can put that in the show notes, I think. We'll put a link to that.
It's almost like an anti-checklist. It's a checklist of things for you to make sure that you've not fallen into the trap of having done.
Yeah, but I worry that some of these things are so difficult, though. Like, if you're going to have like a post-test, that seems like a reasonable thing to do to see if anyone's learned anything. But of course, that is a mini refresher on everything that they've just learned. So that active evaluation is going to skew the results. So how do you even start with this list to do it? Do I want to say properly? Is that the right word?
Yeah. Well, maybe, we start with first, do no harm. So we'll cut out the biggest biases first. When we measure, this is such a complicated field. And, there's been frustration for many, many years. Donald Kirkpatrick in 1960 said, we're not doing things very well. And then Brinkerhoff, a couple of decades later, said we're not, most of what we evaluate is not very good. So we sort of have a long history, but one reason is because it's so difficult, right? There's no easy answers. So I think, we sort of have to get some wisdom about it. It's complicated. One way to make it simple that I've seen resonate with people is to say we can measure for three reasons. We can measure to prove the results or measure our results. We can measure to support our learners in learning, and we can measure to improve our results. And to me, the thing that we tend to miss is that last one. How do we measure to improve our results? Because if we improve our results, then obviously we're better able to support our learners, and we're better able to get the results that we want to measure, the impact we're trying to measure. Oftentimes that we sort of get confused about those options.
And that's kind of part of the crux of it for me is I worry that we're not sufficiently clear on what kind of intervention works in which context and which don't. And the only way that you're going to improve is if you start figuring some of that stuff out. So for all the corpus of research that's out there that can inform the interventions that you put into place, if you're not actually measuring it in situ, you're not going to, you're genuinely not going to figure out, which aspects of this do we need to change in order to improve the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. Let alone, the ultimate thing, which is right. Okay, we can have successful interventions, but do those interventions, does the behavior that we've actually managed to change improve the end results? Because I think that second order stuff, funnily enough, is perhaps easier because there should be business metrics in place. Do sales go up? Do the number of accidents come down? Does attrition improve? All these kind of, sort of final order metrics should already be there. Otherwise, you really have to ask yourself why you're doing it in the first place, or why we're not measuring that in the first place. But it's the effectiveness of what we're doing, I think, is where we're missing the biggest trick.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, but it's hard. So we shouldn't beat ourselves up too much, right? Because, even if, let's say you're doing sales training. And sales is a great sort of laboratory because we have sales results, right? Every salesperson gets rated on how much they sell. It's very easy to measure that. But then you have to ask the question, well, we did this great training program, but was it the training program that made the difference? Or was it some other impact, right? It's hard. One of the things I've been recommending for years is, hey, let's do some more A/B testing. We create these. What typically happens is we have our learning designers, or our learning architects, our instructional designers, whatever you want to call us. And we're all together in a room, and we're like, oh, we got to do it this way because of this theory. And we got to, no, we have to do it this way because it's constructivism. No, we have to do it this way because it's, whatever. And we don't, we just have these arguments over and over, and we don't, let's test it. Hey, let's do two versions, and let's randomly assign our people. And it just drives me nuts that no vendor, no tool provider has created a tool to easily enable some A/B testing, particularly in e-learning because it's easier. But why hasn't that gone on? If we're going to do it on our own, and most of us don't, it's hard because there's no tool that sort of makes it easy.
I think that is true, and it's Owen talks often about L&D becoming a profession, and part of being a profession is that you share the results of what you're working on so that others in the community can learn and use that research to back up what they're doing. And there is very little research on what we do that's actually published, because vendors have no interest in publishing that kind of stuff. That's their trade secrets. And organizations don't want to publish that stuff, possibly because they're not doing it. It's kind of expensive to do evaluation, takes a long time. And then now you've done all that good work, why would you bother giving that to your competitors?
Yeah.
So how do you overcome that?
I'm not a very...
It feels like we're at space number one on this journey. I know I hate the journey metaphor, but we're on a journey and this is like day one.
Yeah, I'm not a very good capitalist, so maybe I shouldn't be preaching to these vendors, but it seems to me that there's room in the marketplace for an organization to do some of this research and then to share it. Maybe you don't share it until 6 months after it's published, so you get the benefits of it. But you create content marketing and you become known as the vendor that really is serious about creating effective learning. And look at all the research we published, and we are, people would come to you. You could have conferences. It just seems to me like somebody ought to do that. There's, a niche in the marketplace for an organization to do that.
Yeah, definitely. I think, and there is nothing to stop a sufficiently large organization from doing that kind of testing themselves, to figure out what works for us. And I think the biggest mistake people make is that they think it's either introducing an intervention and the kind of the control group is doing nothing. It's not. It's doing whatever you were doing up until this point. You're going to revamp your induction and decrease attrition in the first 6 months if that's something that you want to do, and you've got a new design that you think works better. Well, don't just roll it out to everyone, because it might have a negative impact. Keep doing what you've been doing for a control group of people and introduce the new intervention for the experimental group and figure out which one works, which one has the biggest impact.
Absolutely. All right, we need to start a revolution.
But what about all those people that don't get the funky new program? That doesn't seem very fair. They're missing out on the benefit of it.
Wow, come on. That is a good... We do hear that. But look, we'll give it to them later.
We've already paid all this money for the pilot. Why don't we just give it to everyone? Because it's like we've already spent the money. We're not saving anything by not giving it to half the people.
Yeah, but imagine that was the case in medicine. We've got this new drug. Why not give it to everyone? Okay, let's give it to everyone. Oh, wait a minute. It kills people. 50% of people we give this new drug to die. That was, that's an extreme example, but that's kind of like what you're hedging against, is to figure out what works and what doesn't. And that way then you start to improve, because if something doesn't work, if it has a negative impact, you start to look at it and say, well, what went wrong with this?
So, Owen, you've been thinking about this for a long time. What do you think the obstacle is?
Part of it, I think, is the not talking about that third consequence, the potential negative impact, the assumption that is not going to happen. I think it's difficult to say out loud in an organizational context that is a possibility, right? This thing that we've done, that we've been working on, might not work. No one wants to hear or admit that. But the other thing I think is learning and development hasn't been a profession that attracts people with a background of that kind of analytical thinking. So it's more doers and let's get on with it, and less let's figure out if this works. Whereas something like software development's very different.
Yeah.
Was on that point, do we need new skills to be able to do this? Is there an absence in L&D of the required skills to evaluate effectively?
If you're asking me, yeah. We in that research we did with the e-learning guild, there were two things that people said were holding them back from being able to do the evaluation that they wanted to do. One was the leadership of their organizations, and the second one is that they felt they didn't have the expertise to do evaluation. They themselves felt they didn't have the expertise. And what was interesting about that is that 96% of these folks said that their organizations were doing all the evaluation work themselves.
Yeah.
So they didn't have the expertise, but we were doing it all ourselves. So it was sort of that.
That first point about the leadership as well sounds like passing the buck. Is that unfair?
Yeah, a little bit. Although, I mean, you're in a job, right? You got a job to do, and the boss tells you don't do evaluation. I mean,
if you're measured against rolling out the e-learning, then it's difficult to make the case that you should then see whether that worked.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think so.
I'd say it's difficult, but not impossible. You can at least have the conversation and basically say, how serious are we about finding out whether this stuff works or not? And you're really front up for any whatever kind of intervention it is. Is it important to us to work out whether this worked? Because if it's not, then that's fine. Let's not bother do the evaluation. If it's just a case of we are ticking a box here, right? We are, all we need to do is to say that we've done it, and bonuses paid and all the rest of it. But I refuse to believe that's the case for most people working in L&D. I think there's a necessary element of pride in what we do and wanting to be a profession that we want to push things on. I think we need to start having those conversations.
Absolutely. And I think, any leadership who sort of discourages evaluation or discourages research-based or research-inspired learning design is a leader who's going to have their best people leave.
They need a course on the importance of evaluation.
Yeah, that's what they need.
All right. Any final comments on evaluation before we wrap up?
Well, one of the problems in our field is that we're using a model that was built in 1956. The Kirkpatrick model, or what I like to call the Kirkpatrick-Cassell model, because Raymond Cassell was the real originator. It's a model that sends some good messages, but it also is inadequate. It was built before we knew, before the cognitive revolution in the psychology of learning. And it's got some big blind spots. And that's why I worked with a bunch of other people to create LTEM, which it's not a perfect model, but it's a better model. And it gets us thinking more about some of the things that we as learning professionals have control over. So when we're not just aiming for learning, but we're aiming for decision-making competence, we're aiming for task competence. Collecting stories now, I'd love to hear what people's feedback is on it. It's given away for free. People should check it out, I think. My most humble opinion.
I would agree entirely. I think it's amazing that the Kirkpatrick model has persisted for quite so long. It's kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's like the sort of model that doesn't seem, it's a zombie model, just exists, keeps getting back up again, no matter how many times it gets knocked down. Part of that is the extent to which it forms part of qualifications for people working in learning and development. But part of it is it promises to simplify an incredibly complex topic into something that can be easily understood and shared. That's always a warning sign, I think. If someone promises to make something complicated incredibly pithy, you're probably missing out on an awful lot of nuance.
Well said.
So in my Greek choric role, I feel like I should launch a staunch defense, but we are out of time. So
we'll save that for another time.
I'll tell you later. And we will move on to a regular feature, What I Learned This Week, where we share something we picked up over the past 7 days. Owen, do you want to go first?
Certainly. So this is both highly relevant and not relevant at all. There is an amazing new study published in BMC Medicine, which looks at the impact of research press releases on write-ups in the press. So basically, one of the problems with the reporting of health research is that it's often inaccurate and it's sensationalist. So, wine causes cancer, screams the Daily Mail 1 week. Wine cures cancer. The next week.
I like those weeks.
But a group of researchers, they placed at least some of the blame on the press releases that were sent out by the academic institutions that the researchers work in, which tended to be more sensational than the research suggested in order to get press coverage. Right, so that's what they wanted to get press coverage of their research, so they sexed up the headline in order to get it done. So they conducted this trial. So they worked with the press offices to create two versions of the press release for a bunch of new research that was getting published. One was written up in the way that the press office would normally write it, and the other was rewritten by the research team to be more accurate. And then they randomly assigned sending out the press release to the media organisations, and they tracked how that research got written up in the press. So a really nicely designed controlled trial. And what they found was that the press releases that were written to be more accurate resulted in more accurate reporting. So, journalists were essentially just taking the press release, making a few copy changes, but not very much. And so, they did have less sensational headlines, etc. But they also found that there was no difference in the uptake of the press releases that had been rewritten to be more accurate compared to the less accurate originals. So they didn't get any less press coverage, but they did get more accurate reporting, which I thought was interesting.
That's brilliant.
Did it matter where in the paper the press release appeared? Like front page, wine cures cancer versus, much further into the paper, wine has marginal effect on cancer sufferers?
Can't remember.
It'd be interesting. I have an interest in this area because I'm someone who used to have to write up 8 press releases a day for a major news network in Scotland, shall we say. And I killed a guy because I didn't spend enough time researching what the press release said. There was an award going to the late Mr. A, B, and C. And so I rewrote that, an award's being given to Mr. A, B, and C, all of whom died this year. Well, no, they didn't. Mr. A was late. The other two very much on time. And one of them called up to say, hello, I've had a relative on the phone. So
Ross, I'm so relieved. I thought you really killed somebody.
A low point from my career. It was an embarrassing day for me. I knew the person that had written the press release as well. I phoned them up afterwards and they laughed their ass off as if the fault was squarely mine.
Now, Owen, your story tells us about the importance of the translation from research to practice, right? And I think there's lessons to be learned in our field as well. There's people putting out the shiny headlines, right? Shiny object headlines. Things like we have the attention span of a goldfish, so we need microlearning.
Yeah. Short videos get 9 times more engagement.
Exactly. Neuroscience is the universal solve to all.
I like the goldfish one because I saw a headline once that said that fact was offensive to people and to goldfish.
Yeah, that's good.
Will, what have you learned this week?
Well, this is probably not relevant to anybody, but this is sort of a personal thing. So, I've had a little bit of sort of work-life stress kind of thing going on, and I had in my office, I had 10 cubic, not cubic, 10 feet of journals, scientific journals, all around the office in different piles. And in those, I often would have an article bookmarked that I wanted to read. And it just got too much. It was overwhelming. Things were falling over. So I went through all my journals and I literally ripped out the articles I wanted. And I put them in a pile. They're now 2 inches thick. And I feel the likelihood that I get to all of them is still about the same. Maybe a little bit more, but I just feel a lot better. I feel like I can now go on and do my other things, feel less stressed. So that's what I learned about my personal space here.
I do the same thing with my inbox. I get stressed by having a large number of emails in my inbox, so I religiously sort them. Even though I know this is probably a waste of time, it just makes me feel less anxious and kind of mentally better to have it all organized like that. So this week I was reading an article from Atlas Obscura, which is a US-based kind kind of quirky travel site. It goes around the world and it finds interesting stuff. One of which was this headline about our own country, Owen. Buckfast, the caffeinated wine is made by British monks and loved by Scottish criminals. So I thought this was good. I would read a little bit of it. So most people don't drink Buckfast for the taste. Have you heard of Buckfast, Will?
No, never heard of
So
that.
most people don't drink Buckfast for the taste, but for the heady rush that comes from ingesting a whole lot of caffeine and booze simultaneously. Each bottle packs 15% alcohol and the caffeine equivalent of about 10 cans of Coke. Scots have been drinking it for decades. Originally, Buckfast grew popular because of its so-called medicinal properties, which meant it could be sold outside of usual licensing hours. And as late as the 1960s, the wine was marketed as a splendid pick-me-up that restores zest and sparkle. While it's not popular among Scottish population, over 40% of prison inmates surveyed by the Scottish Prison Service reported having drunk some quantity of the stuff before their last offence. And the most surprising thing about Buckfast, given this bad rap, is that it's made by monks. In 2015, the monks made nearly £9 million from their tonic wine, and since they're a religious order, they don't pay taxes on those millions. There's a little insight into Scottish culture for our friends around the world.
Yes, it's this tonic wine. So it's made by the monks, and it has been called out, I think, in the Scottish Parliament by name. It's like, it's the brand most associated with violence, particularly, I have to say, on the west coast of Scotland. But it has all this problem, and there's these monks who are just like merrily making away what they think is, who knows what they think they're making. But I think if they could see the city centre of Glasgow on a Saturday night, they would be horrified by what they've done.
So I abridged that article because the monks had responded to it.
Oh, really?
Or their general response was included, which was that they are making a relatively cheap wine, which of course is enjoyed by people in poverty who are more likely to be in prison anyway. So it's not the wine that's just a coincidence, but in answer to what they're making, it's millions of pounds. And that's it. That's all from us. If you'd like to get in touch with us about anything we've said on the show, you can tweet me at RossGarnerGP. You can tweet Owen
at Owen Ferguson.
And you can tweet Will
at WillWorkLearn.
You can also tweet at GoodPractice or at GoodPracticeAUS. And for more from us, including details of our performance support toolkit and our back catalogue of podcasts, visit goodpractice.com. Will, do you want to plug your website or books or any of these sorts of things?
Well, people can go to worklearning.com to check out my website and smilesheets.com to check out my book. And I do have a new course on performance-focused smile sheets. It's a gold certification course, and it's very exciting.
How are you evaluating it?
Well, how do you think I'm evaluated?
Sales?
Absolutely, man. I got to stay in business. It's all about sustainability.
And can I just say, I would thoroughly recommend people go and visit Will's website and look up the work that he's done. I've been following it for years, and it certainly helped to inform a lot of my thinking about learning and development. So, it's a hearty recommendation from me.
That's a much nicer ending than my sarcastic dig that I was going to end on. And finally, dear listeners, if you've made it this far, you must really enjoy this show. So I do have a favour to ask. If you have a spare moment and are feeling devious, pick up your colleague's phone and subscribe them to this podcast. They won't regret it. Until next time, thanks for listening. Bye for now.